Good evening to everyone who's joined this Zoom session entitled Lea Bridge from Black Marsh. And hello to anyone watching the future YouTube streaming. Thank you so much for your interest and involvement. I do invite anyone to offer comment and additional information. I'm very grateful to David Boot and Joanna Moncrief and the support they've offered from the Waltham Forest History and Heritage Network, and of course to David in his capacity with Leyton and Leytonstone Historical Society to host this talk. But where do we start? It's with an unanswered query from the first part of this research last summer, one that I hope to unravel a bit now. A Lea Bridge farm was on maps from 1777, and a Black Marsh farm appeared in land transaction documents of the 1600s. Yet they both seem to have escaped the scrutiny of what you might say accumulated folk knowledge, but they also seem to be one and the same place. So my take on this now is that a largish area known from post-medieval times as the Black Marsh farm always did include a smaller farmstead, and that farmstead, I suggest, became known as Lea Bridge Farm, but only after the laying of the Lea Bridge Turnpike road in the 18th century, smack in front of its gates. But more of that shortly. Let's see a view of the marshes as they might have been before the Middle Ages. Well, this is not Lea Marsh itself, but it's a contemporary view of Rainham Marshes in Essex, which are geologically comparable with the Lea Marshes in relation to the Thames. The archaeologists at the Museum of London have highlighted this very view as being one that could have been seen on the marshes prior to the Middle Ages, and the Lea could have spread a mile at that time. The late Saxon period saw the start of draining the Lea Marshes for crop cultivation, and later there was major landscaping and engineering for navigation, water extraction, industry uses, etc., which all contributed to the waters receding, leaving in some places a very dark grey sandy clay. Now, we know about this from a 2005 archaeological study that was done in Argyle Way, Leyton, near to the site of the farmstead that we're studying. That ancient layer of dark clay now lies even deeper on Leyton Marsh, because during the 20th century, Leyton Marsh was used as a massive landfill for wartime and slum clearance. So I'm suggesting, nevertheless, that the dark colour of the Leyton Marsh clay in places could be the original reason for some features variously being known as black, including the Black Marsh itself, the Black Path, the Black Bridge, Black Meadow, etc. These names are ancient and seem to have fallen into disuse as the open land has been taken over. But take a last look at these Black Marshes, because now we're going to jump to the 21st century. Here they are, the Gleaming Towers. We're looking northeasterly across Lea Bridge Road in Leyton, and those buses in the corner there are heading westwards towards Hackney and inner London. This estate is named Motion, and I think it does make me dizzy to actually look at these wavy buildings. At one time, the land on which it stands was part of the Walthamstow Manor of Mark, and then it later became part of the Manor of Leyton. Now it's owned and leased by Hill Limited and Peabody, and a 2-bedroom unit here will knock you back £500,000.
Sure.
Let's look at the history that it stands on. This is a side-by-side viewing device which compares the same location at different times. On the left-hand side, we're in Low Leyton, an ancient parish in the county of Essex, as it was in 1885. On the right, we're in the same location, but in 2016. On both views, Lea Bridge Road and the railway form a giant X across the centre of each map. I've marked our main feature of interest, the site of the Lea Bridge farmstead, with a red arrow on each map. On the left-hand map, the outline of Lea Bridge farmstead is shown just east of the railway station that had been opened in 1840. On the right-hand map, the red arrow is pointing at the equivalent location, by then an industrial site known as 97 Lea Bridge Road. On the next slide, we'll see the roadside frontage of this 97 Lea Bridge Road in 2016, prior to its demolition and replacement by the Gleaming Towers of Motion. Here we are in Lea Bridge Road, looking westwards towards Hackney. This photograph was taken in 2016. These buildings comprise the frontage of 97 Lea Bridge Road that was demolished and replaced by the towers. The red arrow is pointing to its centrepiece Art Deco facade. This complex had suffered years of planning blight and had become run down. Lucy Harrison's booklet, Busy Lea Bridge Was Once a Lonely Road, gives detail about its former industrial uses. On the next slide, we'll see the full extent of the 97 Lea Bridge Road works, buildings. Look out for the red arrow again. It's from a different angle. We've turned round a bit in this aerial view. We're now looking southwards towards Stratford, and it's 1952, the heyday of Lea Bridge industry. The red arrow is pointing to precisely the same point as it did in the previous slide, at the roof of the Art Deco building. We can see the full extent of the 97 Lea Bridge Road here, comprising several buildings occupying a whole block. Notice also the density of the industrial development, including a station goods yard for coal, 2 major gasworks installations, other factories and warehouses. 68 years later, i.e. now, the local community is facing up to the physical and social impacts of the redundant industrial installations which had been neglected and abandoned for years, now becoming prey to the voracious appetite of developers. Remembering that Lea Bridge Farmstead was located precisely where that red arrow is now, let's swing back 300 years and see where it was then. This amazing map was produced in 1746 by John Roke. It's part of it, of course. He did 10 miles around London. Using the layering technique, I positioned John Roke's map over the 1885 map that we saw on the view earlier. The red arrow here is pointing to the red dot, which is where the Lea Bridge farmstead would have been had John Roke identified it. I hope that makes sense. I've corroborated this result with other early maps that depict the field shapes and the boundaries then pertaining. But let me just describe to you, on the left is the Lea with 2 ferry crossings. In the middle there's the expanse of Lea Marsh, and on the right the parish of Low Leyton. Notice that no tracks or roads cross the marsh directly via the farm location. I've indicated that the tracks that do emanate from the ferry on the left, I've indicated them with blue arrows as we're going to look at them again. So to look at them now, the upper one is the Black Path heading for Walthamstow up there. It's actually part of an ancient way from the City of London that goes up eventually to a shrine in Walsingham, Norfolk. The lower track leads to the end of Marsh Lane, where it crosses the Dagenham Brook. It looks to me like the Lea Bridge farmstead was pretty remote and poorly connected at this time. We know there were rough paths from time to time, but my view is that no permanent roadway crossed directly from Clapton to Low Leyton here, because the terrain was the impenetrable, dark, boggy clay, the Black Marsh. And it's interesting, actually, that these informal tracks are still in use today. Let's have a look at the Black Path. If you go walking on Leyton Marsh, near the Ice Centre or the Riding Centre, or on Walthamstow Marsh, you will see more than one of these signboards pointing out which way the Black Path is leading you. In fact, David Boot has written an article about this with a map, and you can follow it. So the Black Path exists and is used. What about the lower path leading from the ferry to Marsh Lane? Well, that also exists. Here we are, down on Leyton Marsh at Waterworks Meadow, looking eastwards towards Leyton, and the path is on land ahead of us. These days, pedestrians and cyclists have both the railway and the Orient Way road to negotiate using a footbridge, the girders of which you can just see through those trees. The blue arrow points to the steps at the end of it. This post in the foreground is of interest too. The late Katie Andrews, in her unpublished notes, mentions that this is the only one remaining of the Lammas land strip markers. It's on land that was once bordered by the Shortland sewer, now culverted underneath here, and which joins the Black Marsh stream. But getting back to our quest regarding the farm, history now brings us to an event of particular significance. That event was the creation of a major new roadway across the marshes. The financing of such infrastructure in the 18th century was by means of a trust set up by Act of Parliament. This is the front page of the Act for building what became known as the Lea Bridge Turnpike. The new road would start at Clapton, Middlesex. That junction is now the Lea Bridge roundabout, and end at the Eagle, Snaresbrook in Essex. And a key element was the permanent bridge across the Lea. There had been previous bridge structures in medieval times and post-medieval times, but they were ramshackle things that needed to be repaired constantly. This was going to be a strategic route linking cities and counties. So what did the Lea Bridge Turnpike do to its surroundings? You might say it was the M11 of the day. Properties in its way were demolished, the ferries were closed down, and the railway that it crossed had to be disguised. Part of it still exists as the Lea Bridge Road today. Let's see how it appeared on an early map. Here it is, a brand new road striding directly across the marshes. This is Chapman and Andre's 1777 map. The Lea Bridge farm is identified by name on the north side of the road. There's the red arrow pointing towards it. And the turnpike's 4-mile marker is illustrated directly opposite the farm. I suspect that this literally put the Lea Bridge farm on the map. In the 18th century, this was bang in the middle of Leyton Marsh. The blue arrows are still there, showing where the footpaths lead to. Here, I think they're somewhat demoted on this map, which chooses to feature the turnpike. So what was the turnpike used for? Well, a main purpose was for transporting these people, the business commuters. A booklet by W. Tonkin reveals how wealthy people with business interests in the City of London had begun to settle in big houses in Walthamstow and beyond, and needed to travel in for work. The Rags Stagecoach Company of Walthamstow was set up to do that job using the new turnpike. In 1821, for instance, the toll at the bridge over the Lea for a coach with 4 horses like this one was 1 shilling. Exempt from paying the toll were farm workers and commoners carrying produce or leading beasts to and from the marshes. The turnpike construction was ruthless as the new straight road cut across the marshes and through Low Leyton. We're next going to see the famous example of how the turnpike collided with a large building in meeting the legal specifications laid down for it in the Act. The victim of that collision was the Greyhound Inn. Here it is, apparently, from what we can see here, standing 3 stories high, 91 Lea Bridge Road, built sometime before 1839, and still, if you look closely, sporting 2 lovely greyhound mascots on its roof. In the foreground is the bridge carrying the turnpike road over the railway, which passes under where the bus is at the moment. The bridge was designed to keep trains out of sight of stagecoach passengers. In a breathtaking planning blunder, not unusual in Leyton, I would say, this bridge was built up against the Greyhound at its 1st floor level without any gap, and subsequent access to the inn's now invisible ground floor and stables had to be through the arches that are facing us on this side of the road. I suspect that the impact of this botched development on Lea Bridge Farmstead, which is situated only just at the other end of this long bridge, must have been beneficial. And I suspect that James Reynolds, the farmer, provided water for horses from his ditches and stabling in the yard. 4 generations of the Rags stagecoach service operated here from Walthamstow to the city until the 1870s, after which they mostly took commuters only as far as the Lea Bridge station, a sort of park and ride really, which is just over to the right. But I like to imagine the stagecoaches galloping down this long gradient. The Greyhound, quite a large structure. It does appear on the Leyton Parish Ties map, so let's have a look at it now. I've put the red arrow to kind of orientate where we are, but let's start with the Greyhound, which is on the left-hand side halfway down. You can see what a big building it is. The Lea Bridge Turnpike is crossing the picture horizontally, and a strip of land reserved for future railway is crossing the turnpike from north to south, crossing our picture from north to south. The blue thin line on the left of the picture picks out the Black Marsh stream, a minor watercourse on the marshes, acting as a drain for the cultivable Lammas land, and it was linked to the Shortland sewer, as I said earlier. I wanted to find out who owned and occupied these numbered plots on the map, so I consulted Waltham Forest Archives in Vestry House Museum, and I discovered that the Holbrook family held most of the fields that are north of Lea Bridge Road, north of the turnpike. That is the upper 2/3 of our image just here. That funny shaped plot 501, where the red arrow is pointing, that is the Lea Bridge farmstead. And what I'm showing now that it is part of the Black Marsh holdings. Next to it, surrounding it almost, is plot 499, which is marked nursery, and obviously that's plant nursery. Plot 501 appears to have 3 buildings and a long stretch of water alongside the turnpike road. So who were Holbrooks, occupiers and tenant farmers and nurserymen. I consulted another document at the museum, and I think I regard this as sort of key to the tithe map, land holdings. This page is the main prompt, really, that led me to conclude that the larger area of land on the north side of Lea Bridge, drawn on the tithe map, constitutes the Black Marsh farm. The data on this page basically confirms that. James Holbrook, underlined in red at the top, is identified as the overall landholder of the Black Marsh farm. And he has 3 tenant occupiers: James Reynolds, underlined in pink, James Pamplin in yellow, and Charles Burrell. James Reynolds occupied 1 messuage, comprising a garden, outbuildings, meadow and pasture. And this, I suggest, is the Lea Bridge farmstead. James Pamplin occupied the nursery land, and we'll hear more of the Pamplins later. In the meantime, who was this James Reynolds? I searched on the censuses, and I found him and his family listed in 1841, the first census there was. But to my amazement, he wasn't listed as a farmer. He was listed as a silk dyer. I then went on to look at 1851, because the 1841 census didn't have too many details. So 1851, was he still there? And yes, I've highlighted in this lilac colour the James Reynolds household entry. This page is from St Mary's, Leyton, actually, and Lea Road. That was the name of the Lea Bridge Road then. So we can see in the top line that James Reynolds had been born in Bethnal Green, and Jane, his wife, had been born in Norton Folgate, which is an ancient liberty just outside the City of London. There were 3 sons, plus Sarah, who I subsequently traced as being James's mother. James is listed as a silk dyer, and so is his son, Edward or Edmund. I can't see the writing, I think it's Edmund. They also have a groom and a cook in residence. So it seems that after at least 10 years in silk dyeing, they were doing pretty well. Under the lilac entry, we have there William Pamplin, nurseryman. He's the brother of the James Pamplin, whose name I underlined in yellow on the key to the tithe map. So I continued to look on the census, and I went on to look at 1861, when I found that James Reynolds was described as a retired silk dyer, but he still had 3 domestic staff. The son, Edmund, was no longer at home, and the 2 younger sons had found other jobs. So I asked myself, did silk dyeing in Lea Bridge Road finish in 1861 with James Reynolds' retirement? I thought I'd look forward to 1871 and see what happened, and I found there Jane Reynolds, by then a widow, living on an annuity. And I noticed that she was at a different address. She wasn't in Lea Road here. She was at Syborn House and was in the household of another widow named Sarah Hendry, who had been born in Hertfordshire and was aged 84 and living on property income. So why was widow Jane Reynolds, aged 55, living with widow Sarah Hendry, aged 84? I came back to this 1851 census, and I looked at another page and to find some information about Sarah Hendry. And what did I find? I found that she was in a household that was headed by Robert Hendry, also listed as a skein silk dyer. And this is still in St Mary's, Leyton, and it's further up Lea Road. Robert Hendry, a skein silk dyer, aged 65, had been born in Shoreditch. And there's his wife, Sarah Hendry, born in Hertfordshire, that I had seen earlier. There was a son, Robert J. Henry, who was also a skein silk dyer, another daughter, and 4 staff. These Hendry silk dyers were near to the corner of Markhouse Lane. At one time, that was named Sybourne's Corner. I think this was the same property where I'd found the 2 widows in 1861. The Hendry family seems to have had a substantial silk dyeing operation in Lea Bridge Road. So I'm still curious, so I worked backwards to see if they had been in Leyton in 1841, as the Reynolds had been, but they weren't. I found the Hendrys in Blossom Street, Norton Folgate. If you remember, Norton Folgate was the birthplace of none other than Jane Reynolds. This sounded an unbelievable coincidence, but yes, through other documents, I found that the silk dyer Reynolds and the silk dyer Hendrys were connected by marriage. Jane Reynolds, who was James Reynolds' wife, was actually the daughter of this Robert J. Hendry. She wasn't on this list because she was with her husband in the earlier listing. Jane and James had got married in 1839 at St. Mary's, Leyton. Usually a wedding would be in the parish of the bride, and so that set another kind of line of inquiry in my mind. And that provided the most interesting piece of a document that I have seen in this research. This is what I found. It's the baptism record in French of Jane Reynolds, née Hendry, her grandfather, a Huguenot descendant in Spitalfields. He was Robert James Hendry and was baptized at the French Protestant Church in Spitalfields in 1785, and this is the certificate. I realized, of course, that his surname in French was Andrier, but I'm going to continue with the anglicized pronunciation. I found other records showing that this Robert Hendry and son became master silk dyers in Spitalfields. Jane, his daughter, would likely have been brought up in the French Protestant faith, possibly the reason for her 1839 marriage to James taking place at St. Mary's Leyton and not here in Spitalfields. And it dawned on me how Jane, when eventually she became widowed, went to live with Sarah Hendry at Sybourne House in Leyton. Sarah was her mother. There were 2 more discoveries of interest to Lea Bridge. In 1849, Jane's sister, Mary Hendry, married James Fraser. Now, he's the owner, occupier of one of the large plant nurseries in Lea Bridge Road, a bit further east of Markhouse Road. And in the same year, Jane and Mary's other sister, Sarah Hendry, married John Finley Fraser, the nurseryman in Clapton. So 2 daughters of the Spitalfields silk dyer family married into the Fraser family's plant nurseries business. These family links seem to give a picture of close ties along the Lea Bridge Turnpike among dynasties of market gardener nurserymen and silk dyers. It seems to have been an intriguing feature of the Lea Bridge Road economy between about 1839 and 1870-ish. So let's just leave that there for the moment and go on to something else. I want to move on to the silk production and trade processes. While I'm reading this out to you, the words of the late Natalie Rothstein, that great curator of silk at the V&A, I invite you to look at this image of a dress designed and made in Spitalfields for Anne Fanshawe, née Gascoigne, to wear at her father's installation as Lord Mayor of London in 1752. You can see the dress at the Museum of London, And here we're looking at the gentle author's image of it. Thank you. Natalie Rothstein summarized the silk manufacture trading system in these words. Silk was generally imported by a silk merchant. It was then sold through a broker to a silkman, who in turn supplied the master weaver with the qualities and quantities required. Either the silkman or the master weaver had it thrown and dyed. So these are the processes we're really interested in. Thrown and dyed. The master weaver would normally obtain an order from a mercer and instruct his foreman. The latter, based at the master weaver's warehouse, would measure out the warp for the journeyman, who returned it when completed. But I have to add that Natalie Rothstein herself spurned this particular kind of design in the dress. To her, it represented the unacceptable contrast of wealth and privilege with the wretchedness of the lives of some in the silk industry in Spitalfields. And this is an aspect of the research that beckons me, and I think other people, in future. In the meantime, the value of showing this beautiful illustration, I think, is for us to witness the vivid colours provided by the Spitalfields dyers in the 1750s. Dyeing was a hugely skilled job in terms of technical know-how, business acumen, and above all, artistic creativity. The great textile artist and designer William Morris summarised it more eloquently. He said, controlling the process of dyeing was indispensable because upon it is founded all the ornamental character of textile fabrics. I think it's a wonderful quote from William Morris, and I can't miss out in this talk from Leyton a mention of William Morris, who was born in nearby Walthamstow. Look here at his famous tulip and willow fabric, which was produced on indigo-dyed material that was then undyed or discharged, leaving shapes in the designed patterns for the printing. And I've also referenced his article there on the dyeing as an art, and there's lots more to read about William Morris, but let's move on. Silk dyeing is definitely the messy part of silk fabric manufacture. This 1752 French image gives an idea of all the constituent elements of silk dyeing and the equipment used. And I imagine some of this, at least, was going on at Reynolds' Lea Bridge farm, in one of the outbuildings next to the water source, and possibly at Hendry's Syborn house, which might possibly have used the Dagenham Brook, although I'm really only guessing that. I don't know it. Whilst we're looking at these details, I now want to kind of start to rehearse with you a new narrative about emerging about the history of Lea Bridge. A researcher named Sheila Jennings has examined the factors behind the relocating of the silk industry from Spitalfields into Essex and Hertfordshire over the period 1790 to 1890. And remember, here we are in Essex, in Lea Bridge, in the 19th century. The push factor, said Jennings, was the importing of less expensive silks. The pull factor was the decline in the wool trade. The context for all that was the suitability for the silk industry of Essex and Hertfordshire chalk rivers with their clear waters and the increasing opportunities for transport. Some mills in these areas reconfigured over the centuries from grinding flour and powder into throwing the raw imported silk. The nearest of such mills to Lea Bridge was the silk mill at Sewardstone on the Lea, about 5 miles to the north. Perhaps our Lea Bridge dyers received thrown skeins from the Sewardstone silk mill for dyeing. Because I'm thinking Sarah Hendry She was born, we've seen from the census, at one place it says Broxbourne and the other Hoddesdon, very near to Sewardstone. So there may have been a connection already. I tried to find a picture of Sewardstone Mill, but I was greatly disappointed. This melancholy sketch by Henry A. Cole shows what was left of the Sewardstone Silk Mill in 1893. Just the water wheel and the mill pond, no shed or housing. According to Jennings, the English silk industry only survived because of having moved out of London to this sort of area. And I compared this with what John Harvey had wrote about market gardening in a book called Early Nurserymen. And he said that nurseries were spreading well beyond the nucleus of London in the 18th century. And he mentioned Leyton in Essex as an example. So my thoughts about the dyers and the gardeners are now coalescing. I suggest that the 18th and 19th century migration northwards up the Lea Valley of these artisan occupations was a wider background to a kind of fruitful, practical 19th century coexistence of the messy silk dyeing and horticulture, an interesting cameo of which we are seeing in the generations of the Reynolds, the Hendrys and the Fraser families who lived in our very streets. Further studies of these need to focus on the employment of workers in these industries, and one source I've recently found is Pamela Sharp's Adapting to Capitalism, Working Women in the English Economy, 1700 to 1850. There's a whole chapter on silk in Essex and Hertfordshire, which I can't wait to set my eyes on. But in trying to find the story of the Sewardstone Silk Mill, the direction of my research came full circle. Silk production had started here in 1718, but was ended when the mill became submerged by the creation of the King George V reservoir. The 19th century waterworks at Lea Bridge no longer met London's water demand and eventually closed down. The Metropolitan Water Board, from whose archives this interesting image comes, needed greater supplies from further upstream. So a whole series of reservoirs were carved out of the upper Lea Valley. Thus, the silk mill vanished. This brings us back to the question of what happened to the Lea Bridge farmstead. We've looked briefly at the impact of the turnpike and the railway. The waterworks and the gasworks, which took the fields from the farms and the land from the commoners, heralded an 1890s end to the land-related economy of Lea Bridge. And as we saw in one of the earlier slides, had created an industrial environment which is unsuited to artisan silk dyers and watercress growers. The next generations of the families of Reynolds, Hendrys and Frasers found other occupations. Lea Bridge became industrialised for the next 100 years. Mid-century, swathes of former agricultural land were assigned to industrial estates, covering not only the Lea Bridge farmstead, but also the whole of James Holbrook's Black Marsh farmlands. The nursery lasted for 2 generations of pamplins before the land was bought up for housing. Similarly, Fraser's nursery further east in Lea Bridge Road was replaced by factories and residential development. But we're now in another phase of change. Some of the industrial areas are being reconfigured as residential. Some are rejoining the artisan character of the 19th century. There's not time to explore further here any implications of this. Instead, my conclusion is to emphasize the amazing opportunities we have now to discover more about our past, to understand why things are as they are, and what we can learn about history in terms of making our future. Who knows how long the Gleaming Towers will stand on the footprint of the Lea Bridge farm? More of them are planned, we are told. People in Lea Bridge are now taking history into their own hands. They pressurised the council into this meeting only in March this year, and they're still chasing answers to the questions about the need for infrastructure that they put. This very week, the community, with allies, has successfully deflected a potential move that would have seen Waterworks Meadow, which we saw earlier, adjacent to a nature reserve, turning into a commercial music venue. So I say good luck to those who are demanding that changes are harmonious and safe. Good luck to those people who are trying to ensure that Lea Bridge loses no more of the open spaces that have survived up till now. So here we are at the end of the talk. We're back in Lea Bridge Road on the Pocket Park, which is opposite the Gleaming Towers. And I haven't been out for 10 weeks due to the coronavirus lockdown, but I do hope that this Pocket Park still looks as pretty as it did here in 2019. And I hope the council takes a deep breath to understand what open spaces now mean to people and what benefits they bring. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm glad to acknowledge the help of all the people and sources mentioned in the credits here. And I'd be glad for anybody to contact me with feedback or further comment. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Claire. Well, I thought...
Thank you. Okay, I started by saying what a treat it was, and thank you, Claire, and how interesting it was. I don't live in Leyton or around there, but I did used to drive along that road every day on my way to work a bit further north. So I used to drive up and down there every single day for years. So I recognise it all. But my question actually was, what do you still want to find out? What are the sort of the main mysteries that still remain that you'd love, you're dying to find out? Should anybody be able to point you in the right direction?
Thanks, Nina. I think there's a huge amount that I want to still further delve in, and in particular, that's to do with the people who were the farm workers, the nursery workers, nursery farm workers, and the agricultural labourers generally, who lived in and around Lea Bridge, and what their life was and how they related to the people that I've featured in this presentation, who are basically the tenant farmers and the overall landowners. So really it's looking at what the agricultural and rural working class was doing in the 18th and 19th century, and how they were affected by the big changes, for instance, the arrival of the turnpike, the arrival of the railway, and then the gasworks and the waterworks. So I think there's an awful lot there to look into. And as I said in the talk, I'm interested in the silk industry anyway. You can see I'm wearing silk, I love it. I want to read up that book about the silk industry in Essex and Hertfordshire, and see how that impacts on anything we know about this part of Essex. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right, Matt wants to ask a question. I've now got to find him on my list. Yep. So I've now unmuted Matt, so he should be able to ask his question.
Hi Claire, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. It was fascinating. It was an observation, really. I think what I've been fascinated by in walking in archaeological landscapes is the way that farmsteads date back to sometimes prehistoric times, and that quite often farmsteads will be associated with things like Iron Age structures and post-Iron Age structures and things like that. And I wonder if Lea Bridge farmstead may have had a longer history than the one you've been able to establish, and maybe we've missed an opportunity to discover that by the construction of these towers.
That's always been my fear and my motivation for actually pushing ahead with at least some history on that site, because not far from it, there's a Bronze Age settlement site, which is at Ive Farm, on the George Mitchell playing fields in Leyton High Road. There's something of a similar age. And I did mention in the talk the archaeology that was done for Argyle Way when a new factory was being put up there. And they discovered some very interesting things. So I'm pretty certain that the marshes hide a whole lot of really quite early history. I'm very interested in it. I think probably I'm not the right person to go into that. I think I would need to learn up an awful lot about archaeology. But I think really an opportunity was missed when the archaeology wasn't done, when 97 Lea Bridge Road was demolished. Now we've got other opportunities. The gasworks are going to be demolished further and a new estate put up. There has to be an archaeological investigation of that, and I do hope that the council will have made sure that the developers put that in and don't make the same mistake of just forgetting it.
Please, Claire, a couple of detailed questions, and one of them may be a misunderstanding on my part, but is there any evidence that the farmstead, that is the farm buildings, existed before the turnpike? Or is it possible that when the turnpike came, somebody decided that was a good place to put up some buildings? And the other thing is, on the tithe records, I'm not absolutely sure of this, but I'm pretty sure that messuage is an old-fashioned legal word for a house. And so if somebody's described as occupying a messuage, a garden, some outbuildings or whatnot, that's a house. So that the first two of the three people you found had houses, whereas the third one just had land.
I would think that was right.
Yes, I agree with that. And as the first part of the question about do we think that the Lea Bridge farmstead was there before the turnpike put it on the map, I don't know the answer to that question. Why would the turnpike have put a 4-mile marker there if there wasn't anything? They could have put a 5-mile marker further on, way past that spot. So I have a feeling that something was there. But there again, you could point to the road map and say, look, there was nothing there. There was nothing worth marking up on a map. I think we give up looking on maps because the further back you go, the less accurate they were. There's plenty more documents that I need when I can get back to going out to Vestry House. The documents from post-medieval times, 1600 and before, mention Black Marsh Farm, mention Black Meadow, and so on. And I've got a whole list of them, a chronology of them, that needs kind of putting into a context. And if the context is that by 1777 we knew there was a building there because somebody drew it on a map, what was there from, say, 1400, 1500, which is some of the earliest documents that I've seen. And also there are mentions of Black Marsh lands in people's wills. So, for instance, there was a will whereby money went from the Black Marsh farm to finance the National School in Leyton, what is now Leyton High Road. So there are all sorts of sources of information still to look at, and I really do think we'll find that there was something there, you see the archaeologists didn't ever get their trowels out to dig there, but a post-medieval farmhouse is recorded in the document. But I'll be very pleased if you want to add to any of that, Robert, and if you find anything out, please do get in touch.
Lakeman, okay.
Yeah.
And,
All right.
interesting coming forward rather than backward in time. When and what occasion the massive amount of sort of residential houses that were built on either side of Lea Bridge Road, going up towards the Baker's Arm, travelling north on Lea Bridge Road, when did that all happen?
Well, that was late Victorian, early Edwardian building, I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the Poplars, which was on the corner of Baker's Arms as now, which was a big house. And then those houses going up Lea Bridge Road, they would basically be late Victorian. But I haven't done a detailed study on them at all, and maybe somebody else knows more accurately than me, David.
And there's all sorts of sites, something along the Lea Bridge Road, the history would be very complicated and would stretch over lots of years. So it's not,
We have got this book, David, which is Leyton in 1840 by David Ian Chapman. That I think might give some of the answers for John.
Yes.
This is from get this from the Leyton and Leytonstone Historical Society.
Okay.
Good suggestion.
Thank you.